The wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling the windows as Ethan Reed sat at his desk, eyes fixed on the glow of his laptop screen. Snow piled higher outside, swirling in thick waves, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, buried in the endless cycle of work, deadlines, and emails that had come to define his life. This was how he preferred it. Work was predictable. Work was safe. Work didn't ask questions he didn't want to answer. Outside, the blizzard raged on, covering the mountains in a thick, suffocating white. He glanced at the clock, almost midnight. The storm wasn't letting up anytime soon. Sighing, he stretched, rubbing his temples, about to shut his laptop when a sound stopped him. A faint scratching at the door. He frowned. Maybe the wind had blown debris against the cabin. It wasn't uncommon in storms like this. But then it came again, deliberate, insistent, a scratching, followed by a soft whimper. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't expecting anyone. No one in their right mind would be out in this weather. Another whimper. Against his better judgment, he stood, crossed the room, and pulled the door open. The cold hit him instantly, sharp and biting, stealing the breath from his lungs. Snowflakes swirled in the air, thick and heavy, and at his feet, barely visible against the white backdrop, was a small, trembling shape, a golden retriever puppy. It sat in the snow, its fur matted with ice, shivering violently. Wide, desperate eyes stared up at him, pleading without words. Ethan's first instinct was to shut the door. This wasn't his problem. The storm was brutal, but he had never been the kind of man who saw himself as a rescuer. Someone had lost this dog. Someone would come looking. But as he stood there, the puppy let out another small whimper, its body swaying slightly as if too weak to stay upright much longer. Ethan sighed. Damn it. He reached down, scooping the pup into his arms before he could change his mind. It was lighter than he expected, its ribs faintly visible beneath its thick fur. He shut the door against the storm and carried it toward the fireplace, where the flames crackled warmly. The puppy curled into itself, eyes drooping with exhaustion. This is temporary, Ethan muttered, half to himself. Just for the night. He found an old towel, drying the pup off as best he could. After some hesitation, he warmed up a small bowl of milk. Setting it down, the dog sniffed it weakly, then lapped at it with slow, hesitant movements. Ethan sat back, watching it. Who the hell left you out there? He murmured. The dog didn't answer. Of course. It only curled up tighter, inching closer to the fire, letting out a deep, contented sigh. Ethan shook his head. He wasn't a dog person. He wasn't a people person. He was just a man who wanted to be left alone. And yet, as the storm raged outside, the little creature slept peacefully beside him. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the landscape blanketed in untouched white. Ethan stirred from his chair, groggy from a restless night, and looked around. The puppy was gone. Frowning, he stood, searching the cabin. No sign of it. The door was still shut. Then, something caught his eye. On the porch, a small figure huddled against the cold. A boy. Ethan's breath caught. He threw open the door, stepping outside, the morning air biting at his skin. The boy, no older than 10, was wrapped in a too-thin coat. His arms wrapped tightly around the missing puppy, shielding it from the cold. His small body shivered violently, but he didn't let go. Ethan crouched beside him, careful not to startle him. Hey, what are you doing out here? The boy's eyes flickered up. Uncertain, wary, he clutched the dog tighter. Did you? Ethan hesitated, looking between the boy and the puppy. Is he yours? The boy didn't answer right away. Then, finally, a small nod. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Where are your parents? Silence. Ethan's gut twisted. The boy's face was pale, lips tinged blue. He wouldn't last long out here. Come inside, Ethan said finally. Both of you. The boy hesitated, but when the puppy gave a soft whimper, he nodded, allowing Ethan to lead him in. As the door shut behind them, Ethan realized his quiet, carefully controlled world had just changed forever. Ethan Reed had always trusted logic over instinct. As a lawyer, he had built his career on facts, evidence, and the clear-cut rules that governed the law. But as he sat across from the shivering boy in his cabin, he couldn't ignore the gut feeling gnawing at him. Noah Bennett wasn't just a lost child. Wrapped in a blanket, the boy sat near the fireplace, the golden retriever curled up at his feet. He was small for his age, his frame too thin, his clothes worn and ill-fitting. But it was his eyes that unsettled Ethan the most, wide and alert, filled with the kind of fear that didn't fade even in safety. Ethan had tried, at first, to get the boy to talk. "Where are your parents?" Noah didn't answer. "Did you run away from home?" A small nod, hesitant. Ethan sighed. "Noah, I need to know where you came from. People are probably looking for you." At that, the boy tensed, his hands gripping the blanket tighter. "I can't go back," he whispered. Ethan studied him, his lawyer's mind kicking in. There were two possibilities. Noah was either a runaway escaping something minor, strict parents, school trouble, or he was running from something much worse. Hours passed, the storm outside softening into a slow, drifting snowfall. Ethan didn't press the boy further. Instead, he let him rest, watching as Noah drifted in and out of uneasy sleep. Then, later that evening, as Ethan sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating the dark room, he found the missing person alert. Noah Bennett, 10 years old, missing for 3 days, last seen leaving his foster home in Denver. And then a name, Richard Vaughn. Ethan exhaled sharply, staring at the screen. He knew that name. Vaughn was one of Denver's wealthiest businessmen, a man whose face had appeared in magazines, who donated to charities, who had political connections reaching into every corner of the state, a man whose money and power could make problems disappear. Ethan glanced over at Noah, who sat quietly in the corner, stroking the puppy's soft fur. Was this what he was running from? Ethan turned back to his screen, scrolling through articles, piecing together what he could. Vaughn and his wife, Claire, had taken in several foster children over the years, building an image of themselves as philanthropists. But something about it felt curated, controlled. There were no personal interviews, no heartfelt photos, only press releases, polished statements, and glowing reports. But there was one small, buried news piece, a former foster child of Vaughn's who had run away years ago. No details, no follow-ups, just a brief mention that the child had been placed elsewhere, with no further questions asked. Ethan's gut twisted. He had spent enough time in courtrooms to know that silence often meant fear. Noah hadn't spoken much since arriving, but as the hours passed, he seemed to realize Ethan wasn't going to force him to talk. It was sometime after dinner, just a quiet meal of soup and bread, when the boy finally spoke. "My dad used to take me hiking," Noah murmured, staring into the fire. "Before he died." Ethan set down his mug of coffee, waiting. "He used to say that the woods were the only place where no one could lie. That nature didn't care who you were or how much money you had. It just was." Ethan nodded, letting the silence stretch. Noah swallowed hard. "Richard Vaughn isn't who people think he is." Ethan stayed still. He hurts people." Noah's voice was barely a whisper, his fingers tightening in the puppy's fur. "He doesn't let anyone talk about it. And if you try to leave, he makes sure you don't." Ethan felt a cold, quiet anger settle in his chest. He had spent years dealing with men like Vaughn, men who hid behind money, behind power, who twisted the system to suit their needs. The law was supposed to protect children like Noah, but Ethan knew better than most that the law didn't always work the way it should. "You believe me, right?" Noah's voice was small, uncertain. Ethan met his gaze. "Yes." Noah blinked, as if he hadn't expected that answer. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling. He could call the authorities. It was the logical choice. The right choice. But Noah was afraid, truly afraid. And Ethan had learned long ago that fear like that wasn't unfounded. If Vaughn really was as powerful as Noah claimed, there was a good chance he could manipulate the system. Make it seem as though Noah had run away for no reason. Paint him as troubled. Returning him to that house might mean sending him back into the hands of a monster. Ethan rubbed his temple. He hadn't planned for any of this. He had left the city, left his career behind to escape the weight of responsibility, the pressure of fighting battles he couldn't win. And now, here he was, staring at a 10-year-old boy who had no one else. A choice sat in front of him. Turn Noah in, let the system deal with it, and risk sending him back to a man who might do worse than harm him. Or protect him, find the truth, and make sure Vaughn never got near him again. Ethan sighed, closing his laptop. "Noah," he said carefully, "if I help you, we have to be smart. We have to find proof." Noah looked up, hope flickering behind the fear. "You mean, you believe me?" Ethan met his gaze steadily. "Yes, and I won't let him take you back." The boy's lower lip trembled slightly before he nodded. Ethan exhaled, already thinking ahead. He had spent years avoiding attachments, avoiding responsibility beyond his work. He had convinced himself that his life was better this way, quiet, predictable, simple. But now, with a frightened child staring at him with cautious trust, he knew there was no going back. The storm outside had passed, but a different kind of battle was just beginning. The deeper Ethan Reed dug into Richard Vaughn's life, the darker the truth became. At first, the details were subtle, odd gaps in paperwork, missing reports, children who had once been in Vaughn's care and then, suddenly, were never mentioned again. But as he worked alongside Detective Sarah Lawson, the pattern became undeniable. For over a decade, Vaughn had taken in foster children, always selecting those who had no close relatives. No one who would fight for them if they disappeared. And disappear they did. The official records stated they had been transferred to other homes, placed in new foster families, or, in some cases, had simply run away. But when Sarah cross-referenced those cases with missing person reports, a terrifying reality emerged. None of the children had ever been seen again. Vaughn had hidden his tracks well. He had friends in powerful places, politicians, judges, even police officials who were more than willing to look the other way. Every time someone raised a concern, the complaints were dismissed, buried under bureaucracy and legal red tape. There had never been enough evidence to hold him accountable. Until now. Noah had been hesitant to talk at first, but with time, he revealed the truth that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Vaughn didn't just hurt children, he kept them. The basement, Noah had whispered one night. His small hands clenched tightly around the puppy's fur. He locks them in the basement when they don't listen. Some of them never come back. Ethan had felt a cold fury settle in his chest. He had spent years working within the legal system, believing in its ability to protect the innocent. But he knew better than most how easily men like Vaughn twisted the law to their advantage. If they wanted to stop him, they needed undeniable proof. That was how Ethan found himself standing in the shadows outside Vaughn's sprawling estate late one night. Dressed in dark clothes, his pulse steady but alert. Sarah stood beside him, her expression grim, a small flashlight in her hand. She had pulled some strings to delay Vaughn's security patrols for the night. But they wouldn't have much time. We get in, find what we need, and get out, Sarah murmured. If we get caught, we won't, Ethan said firmly. Noah had told him exactly where to look. Vaughn's estate was enormous, but the basement entrance was hidden behind a locked door in the study. That was where he kept his records. That was where the truth was buried. Moving quickly and quietly, they slipped inside through a side entrance. The house was eerily quiet. The kind of silence that made Ethan's skin crawl. They moved through the halls with careful precision, avoiding the security cameras Sarah had mapped out earlier. They reached the study. Sarah worked on the lock while Ethan kept watch, his heart pounding in his ears. The seconds stretched endlessly before the lock clicked open. Inside, the room was lined with dark wooden shelves. A massive desk sitting in the center. But it was what lay beyond the desk that caught Ethan's attention. A door, heavy, reinforced. Noah hadn't been lying. Ethan found the keypad beside it. Locked. But Sarah had come prepared. She pulled a small device from her pocket, attaching it to the panel, overriding the system. Another agonizing minute passed before the light flickered green. The door creaked open. The air that rushed out was stale, damp, a coldness that wasn't just from the temperature. Ethan flicked on his flashlight, stepping inside. The basement was larger than he had expected. Rows of metal shelves lined the walls, filled with files, old notebooks, boxes stacked neatly, too neatly. Ethan moved quickly, pulling open one of the boxes. His stomach twisted. Inside were folders, each labeled with a name. He flipped one open. A child's photo, a name, medical records. Then another, and another. Names of children who had vanished. Children no one had ever found. This is it, Sarah whispered, urgency in her voice. This is what we need. Ethan nodded, pulling out his phone to snap photos of everything. They didn't have time to take the physical files. There were too many, but digital evidence would be enough. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming from above. Vaughn. Ethan and Sarah exchanged a glance. They had minutes, maybe seconds. They grabbed what they could, shoving documents into Sarah's bag before rushing toward the exit. But as they reached the study door, a figure stepped into view. Vaughn. His face was unreadable, his sharp, calculating eyes locked onto them. And in his hand, a gun. Well, he said smoothly, his voice cold. I was wondering when someone would be stupid enough to try. Ethan stayed still, keeping his hands where Vaughn could see them. This is over, Vaughn. We have everything we need. Vaughn smirked. You think that matters? Do you have any idea how many people would cover for me? He took a slow step forward. Put the bag down. Sarah didn't move. Vaughn sighed. You should have left it alone. Ethan felt his muscles tense. They had to get out. Fast. Then, movement. A blur of golden fur. The puppy. It had slipped past them, darting toward Vaughn, barking wildly. It was just a moment. A single moment of distraction. But it was enough. Ethan lunged. His hand knocked Vaughn's wrist just as the gun fired, a deafening blast that shattered the silence. The bullet embedded itself in the wall. Sarah moved fast, slamming the heavy study door shut between them and Vaughn. Go! She shouted. They ran. Through the halls, out the side entrance, into the freezing night air. Behind them, they could hear Vaughn's shouts. The sound of security scrambling. But they didn't stop. They reached the car, throwing the doors open. Sarah floored the gas pedal, tires kicking up snow as they sped down the mountain road. Only when the house disappeared behind them did Ethan finally exhale. They had done it. They had the evidence, the proof. And Vaughn, his empire was about to crumble. Ethan looked at Noah, who was curled up in the back seat, clutching the puppy close, his eyes filled with something that had been absent before. Hope. Ethan turned back to the road. It wasn't over yet. But for the first time, he knew without a doubt, they were going to win. The courtroom was silent as the judge entered, his gavel striking once against the wooden block. The air was thick with tension, the kind that came with high-profile cases, with lives hanging in the balance. Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table, his suit crisp, his posture straight, but inside, his mind was racing. This was the moment. This was what everything had led to, the long nights of investigation. The break-in at Vaughn's estate, the escape, the gathering of evidence. Now, it all came down to what would happen in this courtroom. Across the room sat Richard Vaughan, impeccably dressed, his expression cool and unreadable. His lawyers, some of the best money could buy, sat beside him, ready to defend him with every legal trick they could muster. Vaughan had spent years manipulating the system, silencing anyone who tried to expose him. But this time, Ethan had something he couldn't ignore: evidence and witnesses. The trial began with opening arguments. The prosecution, led by a seasoned attorney with years of experience in child protection cases, laid out the charges: child endangerment, abuse, unlawful imprisonment. The defense countered swiftly, arguing that there was no direct evidence tying Vaughan to wrongdoing, that the case was built on fabrications from a runaway child with an overactive imagination. Ethan clenched his jaw but remained silent. Let them talk, let them try. Then, the witnesses took the stand. First was the forensic expert, who detailed the discovery of Vaughan's hidden basement, the locks, the soundproof walls, the records of children who had been in his care but had never resurfaced. The jury listened, shifting uncomfortably as photos of the basement were displayed. Then came Sarah, who testified about the investigation, about the inconsistencies in Vaughan's adoption records, about the long history of missing children. But the most powerful moment came when Noah stepped onto the stand. For the first time since running away, he faced Richard Vaughan. The boy sat stiffly in the chair, his hands gripping the wooden armrests, his face pale but determined. Ethan watched him carefully, ready to intervene if needed. But Noah didn't waver. The prosecutor approached him gently. "Noah, do you know the man sitting at the defendant's table?" Noah nodded. "Yes, that's Richard Vaughan. What was your relationship with Mr. Vaughan?" "He was my foster father." The prosecutor nodded. "Can you tell the court why you ran away from his home?" Noah swallowed hard, his voice quiet but firm. "Because he hurt us." There was a ripple of murmurs through the courtroom, the tension thickening. The prosecutor continued, leading Noah through his testimony. He spoke of the punishments, the basement, the times he had heard the cries of other children who were locked away. He told them about the night he ran, the night he escaped into the snow with only his dog, terrified that if he stayed, he would disappear like the others. Then came the cross-examination. Vaughan's lead attorney, a sharp-eyed woman with a ruthless reputation, approached with a carefully measured expression. "Noah," she began, her tone deceptively gentle, "you've been through a lot, haven't you?" Noah didn't answer. "You lost your parents at a young age. You've been in multiple foster homes. That must have been difficult." Noah nodded slightly. She smiled, as if sympathizing. "It's understandable. Then, that you might feel scared. That you might imagine things. Misunderstand things." Ethan's hands clenched under the table. Noah's expression darkened. "I didn't imagine it." The attorney's smile tightened. "But you have no proof that Mr. Vaughan harmed you directly, do you?" Noah hesitated, his fingers tightening in his lap. Ethan held his breath. Then Noah looked up, his voice clear. "If I didn't have proof, why did he keep us in the basement?" Silence. For the first time, Vaughan's mask slipped, his jaw clenched, his gaze flickering toward his lawyer. The attorney recovered quickly, pressing on, but the damage was done. Noah had held his ground. Then came the final blow. Sarah had found someone, a former foster child of Vaughn's, now an adult, who had disappeared years ago and had never spoken out. Until now. Her name was Elena Carter. She took the stand, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice was steady. "He did the same thing to me," she said. "I ran away before it got worse. But I knew one day someone else would take my place." The courtroom was stunned. Vaughn shifted in his seat, his composed exterior cracking for the first time. The prosecution didn't need to say more. The evidence, the testimonies, the undeniable proof of the basement, all of it painted a picture too horrifying to ignore. When the verdict was read, the courtroom held its breath. "Guilty," Ethan exhaled, the weight of the case lifting from his shoulders. Vaughn was sentenced to 35 years in prison. It wasn't enough to undo what he had done, but it was justice. As the courtroom emptied, Ethan looked over at Noah. The boy sat quietly, staring down at his hands. "It's over," Ethan said gently. Noah nodded but didn't say anything. Ethan understood. Winning the case didn't erase the past. It didn't bring back the children who had vanished, the years of fear and pain. But it meant Vaughn could never hurt another child again. And yet, as the reporters swarmed, as the case closed, one question still lingered. What would happen to Noah now? The system would want to place him with another foster family, another home. But Ethan knew what that meant. Another round of uncertainty, of being shuffled between houses, of never feeling safe. Noah looked up at him, his eyes searching. Ethan realized, in that moment, that there was only one answer. Noah wasn't just another case. He was family. And this time, Ethan wasn't going to let him go. The weeks after the trial felt surreal. The courtroom battles were over. The verdict delivered. And Richard Vaughn was finally behind bars. But life didn't immediately settle into place. For Noah, escaping Vaughn's grasp didn't mean he had found a home. The system that had failed him before was now trying to place him with another foster family. Another house. Another set of strangers. Ethan had watched the social workers talk about next steps as if Noah was just another case file to be processed. They had praised the boy's bravery in court, assured him he would be placed somewhere safe, that this time things would be different. But Ethan saw the look in Noah's eyes, the guarded, distant expression of someone who had learned not to believe in promises. Noah didn't trust the system, and Ethan didn't blame him. It wasn't until the third meeting with the caseworkers that Ethan fully understood what he had to do. They were discussing potential placements, reading off names of foster families, when Noah, sitting in the corner of the office with his arms wrapped around Ollie, the little golden retriever who had started everything, spoke quietly. "I don't want to go." The caseworker, a woman with kind but tired eyes, frowned. "I know it's hard, Noah, but I don't want to go," Noah repeated, stronger this time. He looked up, not at her, but at Ethan. "Can I stay?" The room fell silent. Ethan wasn't sure how to answer at first. He had never imagined himself as a father. Hell, he hadn't even wanted a dog. He had built his life around work, around avoiding attachments, keeping things simple. But then Noah had arrived in the middle of a snowstorm, cold and scared, clutching a puppy for warmth. And somehow, without realizing it, Ethan had stopped being just a bystander in the boy's story. He had become something more. He cleared his throat, feeling the weight of the moment. "If you want to stay," he said slowly, "I want you to." Noah stared at him, his hands tightening around Ollie's fur. "Really?" His voice was small, uncertain, like he was waiting for the world to take the words back. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, really." The caseworker blinked, glancing between them. "Mr. Reed, are you saying you want to foster Noah? Possibly adopt?" Ethan exhaled. He had spent his whole life making careful, logical decisions. But this wasn't about logic. This was about family. "Yes," he said simply. Noah didn't say anything right away. He just sat there, processing the words, as if his brain refused to believe them. Then, for the first time since Ethan had met him, the boy smiled, a real, unguarded smile. It took months to finalize everything. Background checks, home visits, paperwork, so much paperwork. But with Sarah's help, and with the undeniable proof that Noah had nowhere else safe to go, the system finally agreed. Noah wasn't just another foster kid anymore. He was home. 1 year later, the cabin looked different. It was still the same house, tucked away in the mountains. But it felt warmer now. Lived in. Pictures lined the walls, of Ethan and Noah on a fishing trip, of Ollie covered in mud after one of his infamous adventures, of quiet moments that, together, told the story of a life finally being lived. Outside, Noah was running through the yard, laughing as Ollie chased him, the dog's golden fur gleaming in the late afternoon sun. His steps were light, free of the weight he had once carried. Ethan leaned against the porch railing, watching. A year ago, Noah had arrived at his doorstep cold and scared, convinced the world had no place for him. Now, he was a kid again. Just a kid, playing with his dog, without fear, without hesitation. And Ethan, he had changed too. He had once thought of his cabin as a retreat, a place to be alone. Now, it was something else, a home. As the evening settled in, Noah eventually came inside, kicking off his shoes by the door. He yawned, rubbing his eyes. "Go get ready for bed," Ethan said, ruffling the boy's hair. Noah made a face but obeyed. Disappearing down the hall, Ethan smiled to himself, shaking his head. Minutes later, as he passed Noah's room, he paused. The boy was curled up in bed, Ollie already asleep at his feet. He looked up at Ethan, hesitating just a moment before whispering, "Good night, Dad." Ethan's breath caught. It was the first time Noah had said it. He had never asked the boy to call him that, had never expected it, but hearing it now, it settled something deep inside him. A new beginning, a family. He smiled. "Good night, kid." Noah closed his eyes, his breathing slowing. Ethan turned off the light and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet, to the steady rhythm of a home no longer empty. It had all started with a puppy in the snow. And somehow, it had led to this.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.